Welcome to the Crawcast. I'm your host, George Krawczak, and this is what happened in Week 3 of the NFL. The first game was the New York Jets versus the New England Patriots. The New York Jets won 24-3. Aaron Rodgers threw for 281 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Jets' leading rusher was Braylon Allen, who had 55 rushing yards. Their leading receiver was Tyler Conklin, who had uh, 93 receiving yards. And then with the Patriots, their leading passer was Jacoby Brissett, who threw for 98 yards. Their leading rusher was Antonio Gibson, who had 29 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Demario Douglas, who had 69 receiving yards. So about this game, if you're the Jets, you're really, really happy. Aaron Rodgers was perfect. He looks back on form. He looks good. He is really, really great. And the Patriots look terrible. But honestly, you kind of expect the Patriots to look terrible because they're not a very good team. I do like the strategy, though, of playing Jacoby Brissett because, let's be honest, they're not going to win a lot of games. And there's no point to potentially ruin Drake May with him play bad on a bad team, maybe lose some confidence, and then struggle because he doesn't have the confidence in himself to make the throws he usually makes. And so I think they can play bad this year, get a high draft pick, get a good offensive lineman or a good wide receiver, and then be prepared to win in future years. So overall, Jets looked really, really great. Again, Aaron Rodgers is back to peak Aaron Rodgers form and is really, really good. And if you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. The next game is the Giants versus the Browns. The Giants won 21-15. Daniel Jones was the Giants' leading passer with 236 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. The Giants' leading rusher was Devin Singletary, who had 65 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Malik Nabers, who had 78 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. The Browns' leading passer was Deshaun Watson, who had 196 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Jerome Ford, who had 37 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Amari Cooper, who had 86 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Deshaun Watson looks terrible. That's the first thing about this game is he's just terrible. He's not playing well. He's like if you looked at the beginning of this game, I can't remember. It was either the first or second throw. It was an absolute dime to Amari Cooper. It looked really, really great. And then he just kind of went downhill from there. He fumbled twice. He was inaccurate. He just wasn't good. And that's kind of the problem with Deshaun Watson is they cannot get out of that deal. So he kind of needs to remain the starter for the future. And I don't know what the Browns can do, but other than just hope he figures it out and plays well. And then on the other side, Daniel Jones looked really, really good. He seems to be getting slightly back on track. And also, Malik Nabers looks like an absolute stud from the draft. So I think the Giants' future is looking good. I'm still not sold on Daniel Jones, and I think maybe to win they need to improve on quarterback, but at least Malik Nabers looks really, really great. The next game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the New Orleans Saints. The Eagles won 15-12. The Eagles' leading passer was Jalen Hurts, who threw for 311 yards and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Saquon Barkley, who had 147 yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Dallas Goedert, who had 170 yards. For the Saints, their leading passer was Derek Carr, who had 142 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Alvin Kamara, who had 87 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Chris Olave, who had 86 rushing yards and a touchdown. Honestly, this is a bad game for both teams. Derek Carr did not look good. Jalen Hurts did not look good. The Saquon Barkley looks really good, and Dallas Goedert really stepped up. But overall, this was a bad game, and the Saints really kind of fell down back to earth, and that is really unfortunate for them because they are riding high with a strong defense, and their defense still looked good. It's just that Derek Carr kind of failed and looked kind of like what you expected out of Derek Carr for the season. And I just think both teams look terrible. The Eagles, even though they're 2-1, they've looked terrible in basically every game. And the Saints, hopefully for them, this is just a one-off, but who knows what they really look like. The next game is the Minnesota Vikings versus the Houston Texans. The Vikings won 34-7. Sam Darnold was the Vikings' leading passer of 181 yards and 4 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Aaron Jones with 102 rushing yards. Their leading receiver was Justin Jefferson, who had 81 receiving yards and a touchdown. For the Texans, their leading passer was C.J. Stroud, who had 215 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Cam Akers, who had 21 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Stefon Diggs, who had 94 receiving yards. So this game was a little bit of a shocker in the sense that the Texans did not play well at all, and it's mainly due to this Brian Flores defense, because basically he essentially does two things. He's either going to send a major blitz at you and rush 8, or he's going to send 3 and put everyone back in pass protection. And so basically it requires a quarterback mentally to try to read the defense and figure out what's going on very quickly to whether hold on the ball if they're only rushing 3 or pass it quickly if they're rushing 8. And, this is only CJ Stroud's second year, so mentally he might not be there yet. And so that's really the story of the game. And Sam Darnold, again, looking pretty decent. This is what I've always said since the beginning of the season. You can watch my earlier videos on my predictions on the season. I always said this. I thought Sam Darnold would be decent because his team around him is good enough where he just doesn't need to blow it. And I think if you're the Vikings, you're happy with this. You're the Texans, obviously you don't want to lose, but Texans shouldn't be too concerned. They essentially had no running game, and I think that was a little bit due to the loss of Joe Mixon. And just overall, both teams are going to be decent this year, and sometimes you just have an unlucky game. Now, this game, I think, is the biggest shocker of the weekend. The Denver Broncos beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers 26-7. Bo Nix was the leading passer with 216 yards. The leading rusher for the Broncos was Tyler Batty, who had 70 rushing yards. Their leading receiver was Cameron Sutton, who had 7 receptions for 68 yards. And then for Tampa Bay, their leading passer was Baker Mayfield, who had 163 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Bucky Irving, who had 70 rushing yards. And the leading receiver is Chris Godwin, who had 53 receiving yards and 1 touchdown. This one actually shocked me both because Bo Nix actually played really well. This is kind of what the Broncos were expecting out of Bo Nix from the start because he had so many years of college experience in so many games. And Bo Nix played well. He didn't make any mistakes. He was pretty accurate. And with the Buccaneers, Baker Mayfield just did not play well at all. Like, he just wasn't. He just did a lot of checkdowns. Was kind of scared to go downfield. He was pressured a lot, so their offensive line didn't really do well. And just overall horrible game for Baker Mayfield and the Buccaneers. But Bucky Irving did look pretty good. And just kind of hopefully with the Broncos, you're moving up in this world and kind of doing better. The next game is the Green Bay Packers versus the Tennessee Titans. The Packers won 30-14, and the Packers' leading passer was Malik Willis, who had 202 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Malik Willis, who had 73 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was Christian Watson, who had 67 yards. And for the Titans, their leading passer was Will Levis, who had 260 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Tony Pollard, who had 14 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was DeAndre Hopkins, who had 73 receiving yards and a touchdown. There's two people that really deserve credit for this. Malik Willis and Matt LaFleur. In the first week, Malik Willis played well, but it was in the sense that he basically just didn't blow it. They didn't expect much from him, and he just played, well and kind of met expectations. Whereas this game, it felt like he actually played well. He was phenomenal in this game, to the point where honestly, if Jordan Love is injured next week, I'd put Malik Willis, even if there's a slight chance Jordan Love isn't fully 100%. I'd put Malik Willis in because just how phenomenal he's been. And with the playing calling from Matt LaFleur has been great. And I think he doesn't get enough credit because I understand he had Aaron Rodgers, who had 2 MVPs and won the Super Bowl before him. But he did lead Aaron Rodgers to 2 more MVPs. And I just think he's one of the best coaches in the NFL. And Green Bay's defense was all over it. They had a lot of interceptions, a lot of just really, really great game overall from Green Bay. And then the Titans, Will Levis is becoming a bit of a problem. He is not playing well, and he's not playing up to expectations. They abandoned the run game really early, but also they got behind pretty early. And it feels like every week there's a new picture of Will Levis doing something stupid. Granted, this week it was him getting sacked with Lucas Van Ness on top of him, so it wasn't that bad. But just Will Levis just needs to play better. Simply, if you look at him, he does have some really good plays. It's just that he has some really negative plays, and is starting to kind of remind me of Jameis Winston a bit, where he'd have some great plays and then some absolutely terrible plays. So, and it kind of makes you think, like, if only they had a quarterback like Malik Willis, what could the Titans do? But overall, again with Sam Darnold and Malik Willis, you do have to point out situation matters a lot. Just because, like, Malik Willis couldn't even beat Mason Rudolph out for the Titans' backup job, and now he's winning games and playing phenomenal for the Packers. The next game is the Battle of the Toilet Seat Covers, the Indianapolis Colts versus the Chicago Bears. The Indianapolis Colts leading passer was Anthony Richardson, who had 167 yards and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Jonathan Taylor, who had 110 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Alec Pierce, who had 44 receiving yards. With the Bears, Caleb Williams had 363 passing yards with 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Roschon Johnson, who had 30 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Rome Odunze, who had 112 receiving yards and a touchdown. This game was like the battle of suck. They were horrible. The Colts beat the Bears 21-16, but Anthony Richardson looked bad. Caleb Williams did look better than before, but not great. And I think the Colts kind of have a problem in the sense where it's like Anthony Richardson clearly needs to play better. Like, I give Caleb Williams a bit of a pass in the sense that he's not playing god awful, he's just not playing great, and he's a rookie. And how I feel is I basically don't count rookie seasons just because of how difficult the transition from college to NFL is, that a lot of times rookies really don't play well. And so with the Bears, it's kind of what you expected. I don't know how many people expected the Bears to be a Super Bowl or a playoff team. So their defense is definitely overperforming the expectations, but their offense just isn't very good. And then the Colts. Anthony Richardson is, like I said, becoming a problem. He's having extremely low completion percentage, extremely low yards, a lot of interceptions. He's getting down there to one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, and he definitely needs to figure out something soon. I think there's major cause for concern for the Colts. And with the Bears, again, Caleb Williams isn't playing great, but a lot of times the rookie quarterbacks don't play great, so it's hard to hold it against Caleb Williams. The next game is the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Los Angeles Chargers. The Steelers won 20-10. Steelers' leading passer was Justin Fields, who had 245 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Najee Harris, who had 70 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Kelvin Austin, who had 95 receiving yards and a touchdown. The Chargers, their leading passer was Justin Herbert, who had 125 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is J.K. Dobbins, who had 44 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Quentin Johnson, who had 44 receiving yards and a touchdown. So this game, it's, again, kind of built around the same teams in the sense that it's like, okay, they're not relying on their quarterback, and their quarterbacks aren't necessarily laying them down too much in the sense that Justin Fields, okay, he is not playing amazing, but he's playing well enough to not blow it and have the defense carry him. And that's simply just what he needs to do. As long as he doesn't make too many mistakes and doesn't screw too much up, the Steelers are going to be a good team. Because think about it, last year they made the playoffs with Mason Rudolph and Kenny Pickett, and I'd say Justin Fields is definitely better than both of them, with Mason Rudolph being the Titans' backup and Kenny Pickett being the Eagles' backup. And if the Chargers, Herbert went down, which is bad, but also they're a team that doesn't rely on Herbert. Honestly, if I was the Chargers, since they are passing so little, I'd probably trade Herbert, get quite a few picks for him, and use the money they're paying him elsewhere to build a stronger defense. Their rushing attack didn't work, and that's why they failed, is because their core philosophy is run the ball and play strong defense, and their defense didn't play that amazing, and they couldn't run the ball too well. Hopefully Herbert's okay. He did get injured in the middle of the game, but overall, just two kind of very weird teams, and I do think both of them have a good shot at making the playoffs. I just don't think they're Super Bowl contenders or will go far in the playoffs. The next game is the Miami Dolphins versus the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks won 24-3, and Seahawks leading passer was Geno Smith, who had 289 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Zach Charbonnet, who had 91 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. The leading receiver was DK Metcalf, who had 104 yards and a touchdown. And then for Miami, their leading passer was Skylar Thompson, who had 107 yards. Their leading rusher was Devon Achane, who had 30 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Tyreek Hill, who had 40 receiving yards. The story is the Dolphins' offense is just unworkable with Skylar Thompson. The Seahawks didn't play great. Geno Smith did not play well, but the Dolphins are just bad. They need to get, if they want any chance to save the season, they need to get someone else. Tim Boyle's not the answer when Skylar Thompson went down. Skylar Thompson's clearly not the answer now. Honestly, like, the only thoughts in my head is maybe trade for Andy Dalton, because I think maybe a 4th-round pick would be fair compensation. Maybe that's even slightly too high for him. But I don't think the Panthers are going to be good, so they don't really need Andy Dalton. And I think he's one of the only ones that can really work for him. I can't really see anybody in the free agent market. Like Ryan Tannehill, I don't think he's that great. And so overall, I think the Dolphins are a huge problem. And the Seahawks, they kind of just got lucky with facing a horrible opponent that doesn't have their quarterback. That's kind of all to say there. The next game is the Carolina Panthers versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Panthers won 36-22. The Panthers' leading passer was Andy Dalton, who had 319 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Chuba Hubbard, who had 114 yards, and their leading receiver was Deontay Johnson, who had 122 receiving yards and a touchdown. For the Raiders, their leading passer was Gardner Minshew, who had 214 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Zahir White, who had 34 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Trey Tucker, who had 96 receiving yards and a touchdown. Honestly, this might be the only game of the year where it's actually bad for the Panthers that they won and they're unhappy with a win. Because it's one thing where, like, let's comparing this to Andy Dalton to Bryce Young, where if Andy Dalton came out there and absolutely sucked, then you can say, okay, it's the receivers that aren't good enough. It's the offensive line that's not good enough. It's the running game that's not good enough. You can say that, hey, Bryce Young is not the problem. This offense is so bad that nobody can win in this offense. But kind of worst case scenario, Andy Dalton came out and played amazing. The offensive line played amazing. The running game was amazing. And it just shows you Bryce Young is the problem, not necessarily anybody on the offense, just Bryce Young. And so that's a really negative feeling, knowing that your first overall pick really just isn't it. I do think it is way too early to give up on Bryce Young, because he only played he played a majority of last season and only 2 games this season. So I think like maybe a full season's worth of games is not enough to give up on the first overall pick. But something needs to change and change soon. Maybe him getting benched will help him a little bit, but this is a major cause for concern for the Panthers. And the Raiders, they're just kind of off. Didn't play well. Again, the Raiders, I don't really think there was much expectations for them anyways. It depends on how they feel about Gardner Minshew versus Aiden O'Connell, because I think at least you have semi-future of Aiden O'Connell, and you don't really have a future of Gardner Minshew, even though Minshew did play decently well overall. So we'll see what the Raiders do at quarterback. The next game is the Los Angeles Rams versus the San Francisco 49ers. The Rams beat the 49ers 27-24. And this is basically the battle of the injured teams. Both teams were extremely injured, and it kind of showed. Matthew Stafford was the Rams' leading passer of 221 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Kyren Williams, who had 89 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Tutu Atwell, who had 4 receptions and for 93 yards. For the 49ers, Brock Purdy had 292 yards and 3 touchdowns. Jordan Mason was their leading rusher with 77 rushing yards. And the leading receiver is Jauan Jennings, who had 175 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Overall, just again, both teams are very, very injured, and I was kind of shocked that the Rams won because I thought the 49ers were less injured. Kind of the story of this game, I feel like, is don't miss training camp by holding out, because Trent Williams looked terrible. Uh, Brandon Ayuk looked terrible. Brock Purdy actually looked really, really good, and he is not the reason why they lost. And just Matthew Stafford, again, looked decent. Just, again, both these teams are just so injured, and it's hard to grade them on a fair scale, and I think the Rams just were lucky enough to eke one out and just barely, barely win. The next game is the Detroit Lions versus the Arizona Cardinals. The Detroit Lions won 20-13. The Lions' leading passer is Jared Goff, who had 199 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher is David Montgomery, who had 105 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Amon-Ra St. Brown, who had 75 receiving yards and a touchdown. The Cardinals, their leading passer was Kyler Murray, who had 207 passing yards with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was also Kyler Murray, who had 45 rushing yards. Their leading receiver was Marvin Harrison Jr., who had 64 receiving yards and a touchdown. This is kind of a messy game for both teams. Jared Goff really didn't look that good, and neither team looked that good. And overall, if both these teams want to make a playoff push, they both have to play better. It's as simple as that. The Lions, I don't really know what's wrong with them. Maybe the defensive have just figured out Ben Johnson's offense, or just Jared Goff is kind of rusty in the sense that he keeps making mistakes. He's not as accurate as he once was, and the running game's still strong with the Lions. They just keep making simple and stupid mistakes. The next game is the Baltimore Ravens versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Ravens won 28-25. Lamar Jackson is the leading passer for the Ravens with 182 yards and a touchdown. The leading rusher for the Ravens was Derrick Henry with 151 yards and 2 touchdowns, and their leading receiver is Nelson Agholor, who had 56 receiving yards. Dallas, their leading passer is Dak Prescott, who had 379 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Rico Dowdle, who had 32 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Jake Ferguson, who had 95 receiving yards. What to say about this game is the Ravens dominated basically the whole game. They basically let the Cowboys come back right at the end, but overall it felt like this game wasn't super close. The Cowboys just didn't look good, and they are a Super Bowl contending team, or at least that's what they want to be. And they cannot keep making, this is what I don't understand. They did not invest in a running back. Rico Dowdle, Ezekiel Elliott are not future Hall of Fame great level running backs. And it's like, if you want to make a run, just get anyone that's a decent running back. They need to fix this running game and stop relying solely on Dak Prescott. I don't care if they have to trade for somebody or find somebody in a free agency. They need to get a running back. This is becoming a problem now. I don't necessarily think Dallas should be too worried, as well as Dallas's defense is also becoming a problem. Their defensive line is terrible. Their linebackers are terrible. They cannot stop the run to save their life. And then the Ravens, even though they're 1-2, they've played pretty decent and were pretty close in all 3 games, and theoretically could be 3-0 if a few different things went their way. So overall, both teams were I wouldn't say super much concern, except for the Cowboys. I think there's a lot of concern with the Cowboys. The next game is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Atlanta Falcons. The Chiefs won 22-17. Patrick Mahomes was the Chiefs' leading passer of 217 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 reception. Their leading rusher was Carson Steele, who had 72 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Rashid Rice, who had 110 receiving yards and a touchdown. For the Falcons, their leading passer was Kirk Cousins, who threw for 230 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Tyler Algier, who had 32 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Drake London, who had 67 receiving yards and a touchdown. There was a lot of bad calls in this game. Yes, that pass interference call at the end should have been called, and the Falcons could have won this. It is very interesting, as I'm not saying the NFL is rigged, but it is just weird how it feels like maybe only the Chiefs play, since the Chiefs have so many primetime games, maybe it's because more people see it, but it feels like a lot of calls go the Chiefs' way. And theoretically, there's a really good shot the Chiefs could be 0-3 right now if a few calls went the other way. The Chiefs really didn't play well. Patrick Mahomes really didn't play well. Overall, I wasn't impressed with the Chiefs. And then the Falcons, their play calling, especially at the end with the final play, having Tyler Algier be the lead blocker for Bijan Robinson, or it might have been the other way around. I believe it was Tyler Algier being the lead running back for Bijan Robinson. It was just a bad call. I think you need to put it in the hands of Kirk Cousins, especially when they had no running game the entire game. And just overall, it was a lackluster performance for both teams. The next game is the Buffalo Bills versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Buffalo Bills won 47-10. The Bills' leading passer was Josh Allen, who had 263 yards and 4 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Josh Allen, who had 44 rushing yards. And the leading receiver was Khalil Shakir, who had 72 receiving yards and a touchdown. For the Jaguars, their leading passer was Trevor Lawrence, who had 178 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Travis Etienne, who had 68 receiving yards, and their leading rusher was Travis Etienne, who had 68 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Christian Kirk, who had 79 receiving yards. Trevor Lawrence is a problem. He is not playing well. He has not played well in a while, and he got that massive contract. I understand it in the sense that the reason why they gave him that massive contract was because if he ended up being amazing, he'd be way cheaper paying him earlier. But you do run the risk of him not being very good, and this is it. Just like the Browns of Deshaun Watson is becoming a problem, it's the exact same situation with the Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence is just not playing good, and he needs to do better. With the Bills, Josh Allen has been amazing. As of right now, I'd say he's the leading candidate for MVP. He's just really good. The defense is back on track, because that was a major cause for concern last week, is the defense not playing well. Or not last week, but like last year. And just overall, the the whole Bills team is a scary force to be reckoned with. They're going to be really good this year. The final game of the week was the Washington Commanders versus the Cincinnati Bengals. The Commanders won 38-33. The Commanders' leading passer is Jayden Daniels, who had 254 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Jayden Daniels, who had 39 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Terry McLaurin, who had 100 receiving yards and a touchdown. For the Bengals, their leading passer is Joe Burrow, who had 324 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Chase Brown, who had 62 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Ja'Marr Chase, who had 118 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Honestly, both teams played great. I'd be very happy with both teams. Obviously, the Bengals not happy with a loss, but Jayden Daniels looks like a stud. He is the only rookie quarterback that's even remotely playing well this year. He is accurate. I was very concerned about his passing ability, just because we've seen him being good at the run, but his just accuracy was a bit off and just didn't throw the ball well. This game, he was amazing and completely reversed that. And with Joe Burrow, he actually played really well as well. I think if you're the Bengals, obviously being 0-3 is terrible and you do not want that, but at least Joe Burrow and Ja'Marr Chase are looking good. In the first 2 games, they were kind of off and did not play well. But if you're both teams, again, you're not happy with the loss, but both teams played very, very excellent. So that is what happened in Week 3 of the NFL season. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. I'll see you next time.